First, I'd like to call up Dr. Brian Ballios, who's an ophthalmologist and stem cell scientist at the University of Toronto, so he'll be part of our panel. Next, I'd like to call up Dr. Tanya Bubella, who's a professor and associate dean in School of Public Health at the University of Alberta, and she also works with Dr. Ian MacDonald there, who's leading Canada's first gene therapy trial for a blinding eye disease. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrew Vieira and call him up to the stage. He's the head of medical affairs for ophthalmology at Bayer Healthcare. Thank you, Andrew. And finally, I'm so glad to introduce Jamie Ring. I wasn't quite sure if you were going to make it, but her flight just landed, and here she is. She's joining us from Boston, where she works as the head patient advocate for Spark Therapeutics. So perhaps that sounds familiar to you because Spark Therapeutics has been in the news recently because they're getting ready to bring to market actually, the first gene therapy that's gone through clinical trials ever. And it just happens to be for blinding eye disease. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Dr. Ali, who will moderate our opening session, Turning Vision Research into Therapies.
Thanks, Mary, and now I have the opportunity to really thank the Foundation for Fighting Blindness for the invitation to chair this. It is in every way imaginable a true privilege, and thanks to all the organizers and the sponsors as well. It's great to see so many people here, and I see a lot of my patients as well, which is really grateful for you to take so much time off on a weekend to come in here. I think this room is almost as full as my waiting room. So what I'd like to do first is just ask each panel member to just briefly introduce themselves and the work that they're doing. I'll start with Dr. Brian Ballios.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Ali, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting me to speak today. I'm a stem cell researcher and also a physician training in ophthalmology to one day hopefully have an active ophthalmologic practice where I can see patients and try to translate these vision therapies that I'm researching right now to patient care. Speaking to some of the points that were brought up earlier, my background is actually in engineering and applied science, and so I have a very intimate understanding in that way of the motivation of scientists to see their research translated into real-life application. And I've always been interested in the useful and practical applications of the scientific principles I've studied. And I think that's what led me to want to do research and pursue my PhD and doctoral studies in types of advanced therapies that will one day hopefully restore sight, and that's the stem cell research, which I'll answer some questions on a little bit later. And then my medical training as an opportunity to actually apply that in patient care. And so my research interests, though, specifically really lie at the intersection of that engineering and bioengineering and the sort of the neurology of the degenerations of the retina. And my focus is specifically on new approaches to getting the stem cells that we do so much research on in the laboratory to be better ways to deliver those stem cells to where they're needed in the eye and in the retina. And I'm thinking about new ways to get the cells that we need from those stem cells and how to keep them alive once we get them there. And why do I think, just briefly, stem cells really are a worthy area to do research in? Well, I really think that stem cells are probably our best hope for vision repair. And many of you out there understand that vision loss comes in many different forms and many different flavors. What all vision loss in the retina has in common is it's irreversible loss and damage of the tissue. And we have many, many drugs that are being developed now to help stave off the progression of that disease, but we don't yet have a therapy that represents a restorative approach. And I think that stem cells could really represent an opportunity to restore the vision and regenerate the normal biologic sight of the retina. So very briefly, that's a bit about me, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to my work.
Dr. Bubella, if you could just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and these events are fabulous. So I'm a professor and associate dean for research in the School of Public Health. I started life as a bench scientist in population genetics, so I very similar to Dr. Sakai before. However, I then went off into a completely tangential direction, and that is into the study of law. And so I am actually the person that people love to hate on these panels. I'm the lawyer on the panel. And I look at all of the non-science challenges that are required to bring really exciting scientific research in novel biotherapeutics, so gene therapies and stem cell therapies, to the clinic. And there are a myriad of those. So we work on everything from clinical trial and clinical trial recruitment and clinical trial participation through the regulatory realm, because there's a lot of regulations along the way, through the commercialization challenges, so I actually do focus on intellectual property law, and right through to the health technology assessment. So at the end of the day, even if you have a great product that you can bring all of the way through phase 3 clinical trials, or for rare diseases, probably only phase 2 clinical trials, how do you get a health system to pay for it? And how do you get those therapies adopted and taken up in the clinics? What are the best structures for those? So I have a fairly broad umbrella of things that I look at, and I would just classify them as the non-science challenges for translational medicine.
Dr. Vieira?
Good morning. My name is Andrew Vieira. I am a pharmacist and a physician by training, and I actually did my research training at McMaster University as well. So unlike my colleagues here, I moved from academic medicine to industry. I've been working in industry for over 22 years now. I'm currently the medical director for ophthalmology at Bayer Canada. One of my key responsibilities is to provide strategic direction and oversee the clinical research program for our medicines in Canada. But I also have responsibility for taking that medicine through to next steps to ensure that it makes its way to patients. And I do that by collaborating with my colleagues in regulatory affairs to ensure that we're able to have our medicines approved by Health Canada so that patients will have access to it. And I also collaborate with my colleagues in market access, working together with them to ensure that our medicines are reimbursed by both public and private insurance companies. So in a nutshell, that's basically what I cover at Bayer Canada.
Ms. Ring?
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. So I do not have a scientific or medical background. I have spent the duration of my career, and specifically the last 15 years, working in industry as a patient advocate. And I think the fact that companies who are working to develop drugs even have this kind of function today is indicative of just the changing evolution of how drugs are being developed and how therapies are being developed, and the role that patients and, importantly, caregivers and family members play in that process. I joined Spark Therapeutics just very recently. I've only been there for about three to 4 months now. I spent the last 10 years of my career at Genzyme, which is a company that focuses on rare genetic diseases, specifically lysosomal storage disorders, and I headed our global patient advocacy program there, as well as our humanitarian efforts around the world to help create access to our rare disease products. I really strongly believe that drug development today is only able to be successful with the support of advocacy groups like Foundation Fighting Blindness Canada, and families and patients being very involved in the process. And the whole concept of the function of patient advocacy is within industry, which is very, very heavily regulated, incredibly regulated. It's very hard sometimes to have that open dialogue that we would like to have with, our ultimate beneficiaries of potential products. And so the function is really meant to serve as a liaison out to the community, but just as equally important, a liaison for the community back into the organization. And so my job is to make sure that on a day-to-day basis, as any company is making decisions that ultimately may affect, some of you, those decisions are being made with the patient needs in mind. And just as important is, as we think about how can we help support the communities that we're looking to serve, what are those unmet needs? What are some of the educational needs? How can we help create programs or partner with advocacy groups to implement programs that will continue to support you in the ways that you need? So it's a very interesting field. It's very much a burgeoning field within the pharmaceutical industry. I think that the industry itself doesn't always have the best reputation, and I can understand that sometimes, but I also think a lot of efforts are being made to do better. And so I'm happy to be here today and help answer questions.
Thank you. So I'll ask a series of questions now that hopefully answer a lot of what I think you and the public would like to know. So I'll ask the panel members. We have a lot of questions. Keep your answers nice and succinct and in lay terms as much as possible. I'll start, Dr. Ballios. You really seem to be a living example of the bench to bedside, as Dr. Sukai just mentioned, and certainly in one of the most exciting fields, not only of medicine, but in all of science. With all the opportunities for stem cell research, how did you go about deciding what specific disease to concentrate on? Was it based purely a clinical decision, or was it based on patient feedback, maybe personal experience with patients?
Okay. Thank you. That's an excellent question. So when you're thinking about basic science and the type of questions you want to address, you want to be able to demonstrate in your first step that you can achieve a proof of principle, that you can actually, especially in stem cell research, that you would be able to restore some vision sight in an animal model of disease. And so there are many different types of retinal disease. And when we're trying to select one to study, we try to base it on the types of connections that we think we can form in the retina with the stem cells and the cells that they make. And so we've been primarily focusing on diseases that affect photoreceptors in our research. And many of the diseases that primarily affect photoreceptors, like retinitis pigmentosa and some forms of macular degeneration, result in loss of those cells and irreversible vision loss. And so we know that we can use stem cells to very effectively generate very high purity cultures of photoreceptors in a plastic petri dish. And so we selected those diseases as ones to study in the lab because those are diseases that are marked by vision loss because of loss of those photoreceptors. And for those of you that don't know, the photoreceptors are those light-sensitive cells in the retina that are lost in disease. And with our stem cells, from a single stem cell, we can make millions of photoreceptors in a plastic petri dish. And our dream, our goal of our research is to transplant those cells back into the eye to replace the ones that are lost. And we think these diseases would be very amenable to those therapies because those photoreceptors only need to make a very short connection to the next cell in the chain in the retina. And so by targeting a disease like that, where we may be able to see a large amount of vision recovery with getting cells to migrate only a short distance within the retina, we think that we could make a large impact with the cells that we're making.
Thank you. Mrs. Ring, you touched on your role as a patient-public liaison. Maybe you can let the audience know what role the public can take in directing research, what opportunities are there, what is your company doing to encourage that?
Great, thanks. So I think there's actually a lot that the individual can do to help stimulate research. And it doesn't always involve, I think sometimes we think that we have to be in a clinical trial to contribute to research. And that's not always the case. Certainly that's incredibly important and things don't progress without that. But a lot of times companies are really looking to understand, for instance, what would a successful outcome look like for somebody affected with a disease? Long gone are the days of somebody just making assumptions based on publications and research that has been done that is sort of older research. Companies really want to understand what would be meaningful to you, and so how do we have a more practical approach to when we look at developing therapies, wanting to make sure that the needs that are potentially going to be met actually matter to the individual. The other couple of things that come to mind are, for instance, there are studies that are natural history studies. So that does not involve receiving a potential treatment or placebo. That's an opportunity for you to contribute either retrospectively or prospectively information just about the natural course of the condition that you have. And that becomes really, really important, especially when we're talking about more rare conditions where we may not know as much about that disease. And it gives companies who are interested in those conditions an opportunity to really look at a comparator and to say, so if we can measure X, Y, or Z attribute with our potential treatment, how does that compare to hopefully a robust natural history study, so we can see that there is some potential benefit to something. Again, in a very small population, that becomes even more important. And I think the other piece is simply helping with disease awareness. So there's a lot of activities that go on today through advocacy groups. I know, for those of you who may be living or affected by, again, a classic rare condition, things like Rare Disease Day, in fact, which happens the last day of February every year. It may not seem important to contribute to those kinds of public awareness initiatives, but in fact it is, because the more noise that can be generated about any one condition, it helps to increase the public's knowledge, which sometimes can help with approval and access down the road, but it also helps show companies that are interested in researching a particular condition, there is an active community out there that would be looking to benefit from a treatment. Companies really, as much as everyone is altruistic and wants to help as many people as they can, they also need to make sure that there is, a cohesive community out there that can help support the development process. So I think there's a lot of things in addition to potentially participating in a clinical trial that any individual or family member can help with.
Thank you. Dr. Vieira, the pharmaceutical company that you represent, and of course most of them have an immense amount of resources, financial, brain power behind it. How do you go about prioritizing the clinical projects, the drugs, the treatments that you're going to develop? Is it based on cost, patient needs, public, again, that we've talked about, public feedback? Maybe you can just briefly touch on that.
That's a great question, Dr. Ali. And while we do have a fair amount of resources in the industry, the amount still is limited. And when you consider the cost of taking a new medicine from the discovery stage all the way to having it approved and making it available to patients in the community, that entire process has multiple steps, and it takes anywhere from 10 to 14 years at a cost of over $1 billion. So it's a costly investment. The success rate is relatively low, as you heard in the previous presentation. So we want to ensure that the investments we make have a major impact on patient care. We want to ensure that the research and development projects that we invest our resource into will have a high success, will have a high probability of making a positive impact on patient care. So we'll take a look at what are the unmet medical needs in the community. We'll listen to patients, we'll listen to physicians, we'll listen to other healthcare practitioners and caregivers. We'll also take a look at what are the available treatments right now that patients have access to, and is there an opportunity for us to improve on those treatments? So taking all these factors into consideration, it helps us to make our decisions as to where is the greatest unmet need where we can make a positive impact on patient care.
Thank you. So obviously we all know that financing is very important. Money is sometimes a dirty word in medicine, especially in our public health system, but it's something that we have to deal with. So maybe Dr. Bubala, if you could talk about the role of financing, what role it's played and how the companies and the doctors and the clinicians can make sure that there's proper use of the financial resources.
Thank you for the question. So it depends on the stage of the research. So most research does start its life in academic laboratories. And in academic laboratories, that research is funded by the public monies. In Canada, the main funder is the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. in combination with considerable amounts of funding that come from organizations like Foundation Fighting Blindness, from patient advocacy organizations, from fundraising charities, especially in cancer research. The patient foundations are extremely important in financing of that early stage research. However, there's a thing called the Valley of Death, and that Valley of Death is where public money ends and private money starts. And that private money is really essential to moving through the translational process, especially as you come out of very early stage, small scale safety trials in phase 1 and start to get into larger trials for efficacy in phase 2, and then the very big trials in phase 3 if those are relevant. And so there, generally the very first pieces, a lot of these new therapies are brought in by biotech companies. And sometimes those are financed in part by the pharmaceutical industry, but largely they're reliant on a sector of financing called venture capital. And these are high-risk, potentially high-reward investors. They're in and out in 7 years. So that financing really drives the timelines between the decision to move forward and the decision to kill specific projects. And it's part of the reason, or that lack of financing moving into the larger trials that are taken up by the pharma sector, that leads to that high failure rate, especially in phase 60% of trials fail in phase 2. You might want to add.
Oh, completely agree with you. It is a very high-risk initiative, but then again, it does produce very successful rewards. And again, we want to ensure that the investments are made in the areas where there is the greatest impact on improving patient care.
I just want to get to just some brief questions and answers because we're more than halfway through and we wanted to leave time for audience questions. Ms. Ring, maybe just briefly touch on social media, which is such a powerful tool, good and bad in society, what role that's playing.
Yeah. So social media, it's I think just on a personal level for all of us, it's really kind of opened up many channels and many avenues. So from industry's perspective, it can be a bit complicated. So particularly when you're talking about clinical research. So in the past, if somebody was in a clinical trial, you would have the conversation with the investigator of that trial that it's really important to not openly share your experience of being in that trial while you're in it because you don't want to bias, other potential participants, et cetera. And today with social media, it's really hard to stop people from sharing their experiences. And I know there's a lot of people out there who, if they have the opportunity to be in a trial, they want to blog about it. They want to share, what's happening with other people, which at times can present a bit of a tricky situation when a company is supposed to be, and researchers are supposed to be blinded to who is in that, that particular trial. You're not supposed to know who's on a potential drug or not. So it has presented some challenges. On the flip side, from the advocacy point of view, it's really done incredible things. People who once were really living in isolation and did not have access to information can now find it readily available. You see people sharing, just tips about daily living. I know, I happen to live right near the Perkins School in Boston, which is a wonderful institution for children. And there's a blog out of that called Wonder Baby. And I talked to that author quite a bit because she lives right near me. And, the amount of information and support that comes from that one website alone is really nothing short of miraculous. And so I think there's so much positive that has come from it. I think the one caution is to make sure that what you're reading is credible. And that is a concern, I think, for all of us, again, just how we use the internet. But when it comes to medical information, when it comes to information about potential treatments and the credibility of the scientific research that's taking place, it is always best to verify, and I think probably most of you know this, but it's always good to verify what you're reading, with a healthcare provider, and I think we just have to be cautious that there is a lot of misinformation, and so especially in a time when there's a lot of excitement about what may be on the horizon, that becomes just even more important to make sure that we're all doing a good job of monitoring, the accuracy of what's out there.
Dr. Vieira, the major pharmaceuticals, do they monitor social media to get the sense of the public, what what their wants are, what their needs are, what their demands are?
Absolutely. I think the social media tool is exceptionally valuable to industry as well as to patients as well. As I mentioned earlier, one of the ways we decide on which areas of research to go into is based upon patient need. And I think social media provides very useful information for us as an industry to understand what patients are experiencing, what they're going through, and what they're really looking for in terms of how they see a treatment as being successful for them, improving their quality of life, and in many instances, changing their lives. Life-changing therapy is always of high value to patients. So social media is a very valuable tool for us to get a better understanding of patient needs.
Dr. Ballios, I want to ask you I don't know if there's much role of social media in somebody in your role. Please address that. But also I wanted to ask you a question on the politics of stem cell research. We all know that there was a lot of controversy with that, where it was really held up, particularly in the United States, for various reasons. And I'm wondering if that had any effect that you saw at the clinical level.
Okay, well, to address the first point around social media, certainly researchers at the more basic end of the science spectrum, like myself, pay a significant amount of attention to trends in social media, and many researchers are very active in social media, talking about the different research they're doing, and it can influence the sort of sectors that you start to put your focus in terms of the types of research that you're doing in your own practice, if you see that the type of research that others are doing is really catching on. And so I think social media has a real role in helping even basic researchers to direct their focus. I think even more so is we pay a lot of attention to what patients are posting about on social media and blogs, particularly because basic scientists are always trying to understand how eventually those developments that they're making in the lab and in the bench side are ultimately going to be translated to the bedside, and how best to be able to tailor those questions that we're asking in that basic science to the eventual life-changing treatments that we're trying to develop. The second part of the question around controversy in stem cell research is a very good one. I mean, there has been in the past a lot of controversy, particularly around the use of particular type of stem cells, embryonic stem cells, in the development of new therapies for potentially life-changing treatments and vision-saving treatments. And this has caused a lot of controversy at different levels, including at the government level in terms of regulation of these therapies. And the main issue in that ethical debate is around the use of that embryonic tissue, because those stem cells need to be derived from the tissue of an embryo or a fetus. But what we've been learning in the last 10 years, I'd say, is that there's many different sources for stem cells beyond just those embryonic stem cells. And I think they've garnered a lot of attention in the popular media, but what a lot of patients and groups don't understand is that there are many other types of stem cells that are also very, very useful for developing translational therapies that behave very similarly to embryonic stem cells, and that stem cell researchers are actively pursuing. And so I think embryonic stem cells are not the end-all and be-all of stem cell research, and there's many ways we can take advantage of the learning we've gained from advances in that domain to be applied to other types of stem cell research as well.
Thank you. Dr. DeBell, I mentioned money probably wrongly as a dirty word, but there is one word that is definitely a dirty word, and that's bureaucracy. I find that when I'm doing clinical trials lately, I'll fill out 1 page for the clinical examination on the patient, and I'm filling out 10 pages on legalese and just acknowledging that I use the right color pen and those sorts of things. So I'm exaggerating just a little bit, but maybe just briefly, we're kind of winding down now. The role of oversight, health and safety, how much of this is really truly clinically driven patient needs? How much is driven by lawyers like yourselves? How much is driven by the accountant? Maybe you can just talk, and a little bit about, if you have time, informed consent
Right.
and the importance of that.
Can I just answer very simply with I feel your pain. So I too am mired in bureaucracy, but yes, probably some of it is definitely driven by risk management on both the financial and the legal side. So there are real reasons to regulate clinical trials and clinical research, mainly because there are real risks associated with clinical trials and clinical research. We want researchers to be enthusiastic and excited about the work that they do, and we want them to put that out there and to give hope to patient communities and to make people excited in the research enterprise. But there are predatory actors out there that do take advantage of those hopes and dreams. There are, in the stem cell field, for example, unregulated stem cell clinics operating in lax regulatory jurisdictions that prey financially and risk-wise on patients by injecting who knows what into who knows where. So the regulators do have real risks to take into account. In terms of clinical trials are part of the translational experimental process. Clinical trials are experiments. They are not treatment. And oftentimes, I think patients will go into clinical trials thinking that this is a treatment for their disease. Especially at the early stages in phase 1 and before there is any efficacy or real efficacy data out there, these things are not treatments, they are experiments. And so the joining in and becoming part of a clinical trial requires some understanding and protections. The legal way that we regulate clinical trials is through, I sit on our university research ethics board. And so we oversee the clinical trials and the consent process to ensure that patients really, or participants in clinical trials, really understand all of the risks that are associated with such participation. And with very novel therapeutics where we don't have good safety profiles, those risks are quite real. In terms of moving through the health and safety regulations, every country that runs, I would say, a coherent clinical development program has the equivalent of Health Canada. So it's the Food and Drug Administration in the USA, the European Medicines Agency in Europe. Every jurisdiction or country has an agency that looks at whether trials have appropriate evidence base to warrant or to start considering putting them into actual humans. So most of these trials are based on animal data, sometimes only on small animal data. Usually there is some requirement for large animal data. So the Spark Therapeutics trial that's just come through was in mice initially, and then in dogs as an animal model or large animal model before it got anywhere near humans. So the regulators are a little bit sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So when things go wrong and there's big recalls of drugs that go horribly awry, the regulators are blamed for improper oversight. But then, especially in the rare diseases community, they're also blamed for being too cautious and not letting treatments through and access for patients rapidly enough. They have a statutory mandate from the Government of Canada to protect the safety and the interests of Canadians, and that includes clinical trial participants. They move as quickly as they can, and there's certainly been a great drive and a great push recently to at least facilitate things like conditional licensing approvals to enable earlier access in the rare diseases community where there's an understanding that those trials are going to be smaller and the patient numbers are going to be smaller. And then to have sort of a conditional approval, then followed by monitoring once the thing is actually already on the market. Now with Vanessa's law that has just come in, there's going to be an ability for the regulators to pull things more rapidly from the market if they do turn out not to be safe.
Thank you. So I'm going to open this up for questions from the audience, and I'll just remind you we have other sessions later on, so this is not the time to ask specific medical questions, certainly not questions about yourself. Ask the doctors later on. General questions related to what the topics that we've had, and we can get the runners if you need a microphone here. I see a question there, and just keep your questions very brief so we can get as many of them as we can. I already see more questions that we'll have time, but I'll get Mary to just close this off whenever she feels it's time.
Oh, okay, great.
Yes.
Yes, my question is for Dr. Bubella and Dr. Vieira primarily. From an industry perspective, what are the challenges in the drug regulatory framework in Canada, and what are some improvements that you'd like to see, and maybe particularly in the rare drug or orphan drug arena?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last question you had.
So you're looking at the Canada's new orphan drug framework?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's still in the works. There was a draft orphan drugs framework for Canada that mirrors what is being done in other jurisdictions. So the United States has had a fairly functional regulatory approval process, a fast-track process for orphan drugs, and to meet significant unmet medical need for some time. The Europeans also have a orphan drug framework. The goal in Canada is to bring that in. It has been working its way through the regulatory process fairly rapidly. It should be online relatively soon. And that is basically what I was saying. So the way that clinical trials usually operate is you have very small safety trials in phase 1 that's maybe only up to 12 participants. Then early stage sort of safety and efficacy trials to get some data on at least does this work in principle, so maybe with 20 or so patients or up to 60. And then the big phase 3 trials, which are the randomized controlled trials, although there might be some randomization, meaning you don't know whether you're going to get a placebo or whether you're going to get the active therapeutic or intervention. With an orphan drug framework, you start to speed that through where you don't necessarily need to move all the way into phase 3. So for example, with a gene therapy for LCA, these are sort of phase 2, phase 3 trials. There's just not enough patients to do those big kind of huge randomized controlled trials that you would see in the pharmaceutical development. So orphan drug frameworks are put into place to provide incentives for developers to work on orphan drugs. And they are put into place to try to diminish the paperwork and the regulatory burden so that those things are shepherded through more quickly. But at the same time, there needs to be enough oversight in place that when it comes onto the market, if it's proven to not be either safe or efficacious, there's an ability to pull those things. And that is still playing out in the system. It's still early days for that.
So in the interest of time, I think we might take another question on a different topic.
Yes, my question here is, how successful are the cell transplant being done so far today in general?
So Dr. Ballius, maybe you can, I think really the bottom line is, when are we going to be using these in patients, really?
Yeah, so I think one of the really exciting things about stem cell applications in the eye is that there are already phase 1 clinical trials going on right now for cells derived from stem cells being put into the eye, and in trials going on in the UK and in the US and recently in Japan. And these stem cell trials have so far been focused on those pigmented cells. But many of you have probably heard of the retinal pigment epithelial cells, the RPE cells. And right now, there are phase 1 trials for replacement of RPE cells going on in the context of, for example, Stargardt's macular dystrophy. And there was a publication last year in one of the scientific journals looking at early survival data on those cells being able to survive after transplantation, and early visual recovery in that small cohort of patients that have been receiving those injections. And the exciting thing is that they were able to see that these cells are actually surviving underneath the retina and looking, at least on the types of imaging that we can do in the eye, just like your normal pigmented epithelial would look. And so already we're being able to translate stem cell therapies towards clinical trials, and I think this is going to open up the door to even a more diverse type of stem cell-derived therapies for other types of cells, like the photoreceptors I mentioned earlier. I just finished by very briefly touching on a point that was raised earlier around, probably for lack of a better word, predatory companies that are offering stem cell therapies that really lack good, rigorous scientific evidence underneath them. And I think as stem cell scientists, we're all very concerned about what this really means in the future. And it really undermines our credibility as scientists if patients are getting therapies that don't have good evidence behind them. And so I think it is definitely in your best interest to explore and get more information, either from your healthcare provider or other sources, before you think about undertaking your enrollment in a stem cell trial. And I would just finish by saying I direct your attention to a great website put out by the International Society for Stem Cell Research. I can give you that information later if anyone wants it. It's called Stem Cells: A Closer Look, and it gives a lot of information around the evidence for bona fide and evidence-based trials in stem cells.
One more question.
If you're not getting the stem cells from an embryo or a fetus, where else would it come from?
So the alternative sources to embryonic stem cells or fetal stem cells are adult stem cells, for example. So in all of our different tissues in the body, there exist stem cells that help to build those tissues during life, and those cells will, after they're finished building those tissues in the adult, will go quiet. And in some types of our tissues, those are still active. So when we injure our skin, for example, our skin can heal. In our retina, for example, when we injure our retina, those cells don't reactivate. And so a lot of our research right now is trying to figure out how can we get those cells to grow and turn into the types of cells that we want in that tissue. A second type of stem cell that's very exciting is something called an induced pluripotent stem cell, and there's a lot of jargon there. But what that essentially means is that they're able to take an adult cell, like an adult skin cell that they could take from a skin biopsy, and using chemical factors, using compounds and molecules in a petri dish, able to change those cells from a skin biopsy back into cells that behave exactly like embryonic stem cells, but they're not derived from the embryo or fetal tissue. They're derived from your own skin, for example.
I'm just going to add one really quick question, quick statement. There's about 3,000 or so stem cell clinical trials going on around the world, or that are completed or that are in progress. Of those, most of them use blood stem cells. Of the 3,000, there's only about 6 or 7 that use cells that are derived from human embryonic stem cells. So even though this is one of those beware of what you read in the media, even though the media is disproportionately focused on human embryonic stem cells, there's actually very, very little or very few clinical trials that are ongoing. Some of them are in the ophthalmic or the eye space.
Great, thanks.
That's a good point.
I think we have to conclude. I'd like to give my thanks to the panel. Very knowledgeable panel and great discussions. I think we could have gone on for much longer, and I know a lot of you had questions. I'll be doing the next session on clinical trials and clinical research in AMD, and that's a good opportunity. Probably some of those questions will be appropriate or in the Ask the Doctor. So I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions, but I'm sure you were anxious to hear what our esteemed panel had to say. So thank you for your attention.